Chapter 15. The Disaster Within. The Sunday after Miss Bartlett's arrival was a glorious day, like most of the days of that year. In the Weald, autumn approached, breaking up the green monotony of summer, touching the parks with the grey bloom of mist, the beech trees with russet, the oak trees with gold. Up on the heights, battalions of black pines witnessed the change, themselves unchangeable. Either country was spanned by a cloudless sky, and in either arose the tinkle of church bells. The garden of Windy Corners was deserted except for a red book, which lay sunning itself upon the gravel path. From the house came incoherent sounds, as of females preparing for worship. Degree the men say they won t. Go, plus or minus degree well, I don't blame them, plus or minus Minnie says, degree need she go, plus or minus degree tell her. No nonsense, plus or minus degree Anne. Mary. Hook me behind, plus or minus degree dearest Lucia, may I trespass upon you for a pin, plus or minus for Miss Bartlett had announced that she, at all events, was one for church. The sun rose higher on its journey, guided, not by Phaeton, but by Apollo, competent, unswerving, divine. Its rays fell on the ladies whenever they advanced towards the bedroom windows, on Mr. Beebe down at Summer Street as he smiled over a letter from Miss Catherine Allen, on George Emerson cleaning his father's boots, and lastly, to complete the catalogue of memorable things, on the red book mentioned previously. The ladies move, Mr. Beebe moves, George moves, and movement may engender shadow. But this book lies motionless, to be caressed all the morning by the sun and to raise its cover slightly, as though acknowledging the caress. Presently Lucy steps out of the drawing-room window. Her new cerise dress has been a failure, and makes her look tawdry and wan. At her throat is a garnet brooch, on her finger a ring set with rubies, an engagement ring. Her eyes are bent to the Weald. She frowns a little, not in anger, but as a brave child frowns when he is trying not to cry. In all that expanse no human eye is looking at her, and she may frown unrebuked and measure the spaces that yet survive between Apollo and the western hills. Degree Lucy. Lucy. What's that book? Who's been taking a book out of the shelf and leaving it about to spoil, plus or minus? Degree it's only the library book that Cecil's been reading. Plus or minus. Degree but pick it up, and don't stand idling there like a flamingo. Plus or minus. Lucy picked up the book and glanced at the title listlessly, under a Logia. She no longer read novels herself, devoting all her spare time to solid literature in the hope of catching Cecil up. It was dreadful. How little she knew, and even when she thought she knew a thing, like the Italian painters, she found she had forgotten it. Only this morning she had confused Francesco Francia with Piero della Francesca, and Cecil had said, degree what? You aren't forgetting your Italy already, plus or minus, and this too had lent anxiety to her eyes when she saluted the deer view and the deer garden in the foreground, and above them, scarcely conceivable elsewhere, the dear sun. Degree Lucy, have you a sixpence for Minnie and a shilling for yourself, plus or minus? She hastened in to her mother, who was rapidly working herself into a Sunday fluster. Degree it's a special collection, I forget what for. I do beg, no vulgar clinking in the plate with halfpennies, see that Minnie has a nice bright sixpence. Where is the child? Minnie. That book's all warped. Gracious, how plain you look. Put it under the atlas to press. Minnie, plus or minus. Degree, oh, Mrs. Honeychurch, plus or minus from the upper regions. Degree Minnie, don't be late. Here comes the horse, plus or minus it was always the horse. Never the carriage. Degree where's Charlotte? Run up and hurry her. Why is she so long? She had nothing to do. She never brings anything but blouses. Poor Charlotte, how I do detest blouses. Minnie, plus or minus. Paganism is infectious, more infectious than diphtheria or piety, and the rector's niece was taken to church protesting. As usual, she didn't see. Why? Why shouldn't she sit in the sun with the young men? The young men, who had now appeared, mocked her with ungenerous words. Mrs. Honeychurch defended orthodoxy, and in the midst of the confusion Miss Bartlett, dressed in the very height of the fashion, came strolling down the stairs. Dear Marian, I am very sorry, but I have no small change, nothing but sovereigns and half-crowns. Could anyone give me plus or minus? Yes, easily. Jump in. Gracious me, how smart you look. What a lovely frock. You put us all to shame. Plus or minus. If I did not wear my best rags and tatters now, when should I wear them? Plus or minus, said Miss Bartlett reproachfully. She got into the victoria and placed herself with her back to the horse. The necessary roar ensued. And then they drove off. Goodbye. Be good, plus or minus, called out Cecil. Lucy bit her lip, for the tone was sneering. On the subject of Church. And so on. Plus or minus, they had had rather an unsatisfactory conversation. He had said that people ought to overhaul themselves, and she did not want to overhaul herself. She did not know it was done. Honest orthodoxy Cecil respected, but he always assumed that honesty is the result of a spiritual crisis. He could not imagine it as a natural birthright that might grow heavenward like flowers. All that he said on this subject pained her, though he exuded tolerance from every pore. Somehow the Emersons were different. She saw the Emersons after church. There was a line of carriages down the road, and the Honeychurch vehicle happened to be opposite Sissy Villa. To save time, they walked over the green to it, and found father and son smoking in the garden. Introduce me, plus or minus, said her mother. Unless the young man considers that he knows me already. Plus or minus. He probably did, but Lucy ignored the sacred lake and introduced them formally. Old Mr. Emerson claimed her with much warmth, and said how glad he was that she was going to be married. She said yes, she was glad too, and then, as Miss Bartlett and Minnie were lingering behind with Mr. Beebe, she turned the conversation to a less disturbing topic and asked him how he liked his new house. Very much, plus or minus, he replied, but there was a note of offense in his voice. She had never known him offended before. He added, we find, though, that the Miss Allens were coming, and that we have turned them out. Women mind such a thing. I am very much upset about it. Plus or minus. I believe that there was some misunderstanding, plus or minus, said Mrs. Honeychurch uneasily. Our landlord was told that we should be a different type of person, plus or minus, said George, who seemed disposed to carry the matter further. He thought we should be artistic. He is disappointed. Plus or minus. And I wonder whether we ought to write to the Miss Allens and offer to give it up. What do you think, plus or minus? He appealed to Lucy. Oh, stop now, you have come, plus or minus, said Lucy lightly. She must avoid censuring Cecil. For it was on Cecil that the little episode turned, though his name was never mentioned. So George says. He says that the Miss Allens must go to the wall. Yet it does seem so unkind. Plus or minus. There is only a certain amount of kindness in the world, plus or minus, said George, watching the sunlight flash on the panels of the passing carriages. Yes, plus or minus, exclaimed Mrs. Honeychurch. That's exactly what I say. Why all This twiddling and twaddling over 2 Miss Allens, plus or minus. Degree there is a certain amount of kindness, just as there is a certain amount of light, plus or minus, he continued in measured tones. Degree we cast a shadow on something wherever we stand, and it is no good moving from place to place to save things, because the shadow always follows. Choose a place where you one t do harm. Yes, choose a place where you one t do very much harm, and stand in it for all you are worth, facing the sunshine. Plus or minus. Degree, oh, Mr. Emerson, I see you re clever, plus or minus. Degree, plus or minus. Degree, I see you re going to be clever. I hope you didn't go behaving like that to poor Freddie. Plus or minus. George's eyes laughed, and Lucy suspected that he and her mother would get on rather well. Degree, no, I didn't plus or minus, he said. Degree, he behaved that way to me. It is his philosophy. Only he starts life with it, and I have tried the note of interrogation first. Plus or minus. Degree, what underscore do underscore you mean? No, never mind what you mean. Don, explain. He looks forward to seeing you this afternoon. Do you play tennis? Do you mind tennis on Sunday, plus or minus? Degree, George, mind tennis on Sunday. George, after his education, distinguish between Sunday, plus or minus. Degree, very well, George doesn't mind tennis on Sunday. No more do I. That's settled. Mr. Emerson, if you could come with your son we should be so pleased. Plus or minus. He thanked her, but the walk sounded rather far, he could only potter about in these days. She turned to George, Degree, and then he wants to give up his house to the Miss Allens. Plus or minus. Degree, I know, plus or minus, said George, and put his arm round his father's neck. The kindness that Mr. Beebe and Lucy had always known to exist in him came out suddenly, like sunlight touching a vast landscape, a touch of the morning sun. She remembered that in all his perversities he had never spoken against affection. Miss Bartlett approached. Degree, you know our cousin, Miss Bartlett, plus or minus, said Mrs. Honeychurch pleasantly. Degree, you met her with my daughter in Florence. Plus or minus. Degree, yes, indeed, plus or minus, said the old man, and made as if he would come out of the garden to meet the lady. Miss Bartlett promptly got into the Victoria. Thus entrenched, she emitted a formal bow. It was the pension. Bertolini again, the dining table with the decanters of water and wine. It was the old battle of the room with the view. George did not respond to the bow. Like any boy, he blushed and was ashamed. He knew that the chaperone remembered. He said, Degree, I'll come up to tennis if I can manage it, plus or minus, and went into the house. Perhaps anything that he did would have pleased Lucy, but his awkwardness went straight to her heart. Men were not gods after all, but as human and as clumsy as girls. Even men might suffer from unexplained desires, and need help. To one of her upbringing, and of her destination, the weakness of men was a truth unfamiliar, but she had surmised it at Florence, when George threw her photographs into the River Arno. Degree, George, go, plus or minus, cried his father, who thought it a great treat for people if his son would talk to them. Degree, George has been in such good spirits today, and I am sure he will end by coming up this afternoon. Plus or minus. Lucy caught her cousin's eye. Something in its mute appeal made her reckless. Degree, yes, plus or minus, she said, raising her voice. Degree, I do hope he will. Plus or minus then. She went to the carriage and murmured, Degree, the old man hasn't been told. I knew it was all right. Plus or minus. Mrs. Honeychurch followed her, and they drove away. Satisfactory that Mr. Emerson had not been told of the Florence escapade, yet Lucy's spirits should not have leapt up as if she had. sighted the ramparts of heaven. Satisfactory, yet surely she greeted it with disproportionate joy. All the way home the horses' hoofs sang a tune to her. Degree he has not told. Plus or minus her brain expanded the melody. Degree he has not told his father, to whom he tells all things. It was not an exploit. He did not laugh at me when I had gone. Plus or minus she raised her hand to her cheek. Degree he does not love me. No. How terrible if he did. But he has not told. He will not tell. Plus or minus. She longed to shout the words, Degree, it is all right. It's a secret between us two forever. Cecil will never hear. Plus or minus she was even glad that Miss Bartlett had made her promise secrecy that last dark evening at Florence, when they had knelt packing in his room. The secret, big or little, was guarded. Only 3 English people knew of it in the world. Thus she interpreted her joy. She greeted Cecil with unusual radiance, because she felt so safe. As he helped her out of the carriage, she said, Degree, the Emersons have been so nice. George Emerson has improved enormously. Plus or minus. Degree, how are my prot.gs, plus or minus, asked Cecil, who took no real interest in them, and had long since forgotten his resolution to bring them to Windy Corner for educational purposes. Degree prot.gs, plus or minus, she exclaimed with some warmth. For the only relationship which Cecil conceived was futile, that of protector and protected. He had no glimpse of the comradeship after which the girl's soul yearned. Degree, you shall see for yourself how your prot.gs are. George Emerson is coming up this afternoon. He is a most interesting man to talk to. Only Don, T plus or minus, she nearly said, Degree Don, T protect him. Plus or minus, but the bell was ringing for lunch, and, as often happened, Cecil had paid no great attention to her remarks. Charm, not argument, was to be her forte. Lunch was a cheerful meal. Generally Lucy was depressed at meals. One had to be soothed, either Cecil or Miss Bartlett, or a being not visible to the mortal eye, a being who whispered to her soul, Degree, it will not last, this cheerfulness. In January you must go to London to entertain the grandchildren of celebrated men. Plus or minus, but today she felt she had received a guarantee. Her mother would always sit there, her brother here. The sun, though it had moved a little since the morning, would never be hidden behind the western hills. After luncheon they asked her to play. She had seen Gluck's Armide that year, and played from memory the music of the Enchanted Garden, the music to which Renaud approaches, beneath the light of an eternal dawn, the music that never gains, never wanes, but ripples forever like the tideless seas of fairyland. Such music is not for the piano, and her audience began to get restive, and Cecil, sharing the discontent, called out, Degree, now play us the other garden, the one in Parsifal. Plus or minus. She closed the instrument. Degree, not very dutiful, plus or minus, said her mother's voice. Fearing that she had offended Cecil, she turned quickly round. There George was. He had crept in without interrupting her. Degree, oh, I had no idea, plus or minus, she exclaimed, getting very red, and then, without a word of greeting, she reopened the piano. Cecil should have the Parsifal, and anything else that he liked. Degree, our performer has changed her mind, plus or minus, said Miss Bartlett, perhaps implying she will play the music to Mr. Emerson. Lucy did not know what to do, nor even what she wanted to do. She played a few bars of the Flower Maidens song very badly, and then she stopped. Degree, I vote tennis, plus or minus, said Freddie, disgusted at the scrappy entertainment. Degree, yes, so do I. Plus or minus, once more she closed the unfortunate piano. Degree, I vote you. Have a man S4. Plus or minus. Degree alright. Plus or minus. Degree not for me, thank you, plus or minus, said Cecil. Degree, I will not spoil the set. Plus or minus. He never realized that it may be an act of kindness in a bad player to make up a fourth. Degree, oh, come along Cecil. I am bad, Floyd S. rotten, and so I dare say S. Emerson. Plus or minus. George corrected him, degree, I am not bad. Plus or minus. One looked down one's nose at this. Degree, then certainly I won T play, plus or minus, said Cecil, while Miss Bartlett, under the impression that she was snubbing George, added, degree, I agree with you, Mr. Vice. You had much better not play. Much better not. Plus or minus. Minnie, rushing in where Cecil feared to tread, announced that she would play. Degree, I shall miss every ball anyway, so what does it matter, plus or minus? But Sunday intervened and stamped heavily upon the kindly suggestion. Degree, then it will have to be Lucy, plus or minus, said Mrs. Honeychurch, degree, you must fall back on Lucy. There is no other way out of it. Lucy, go and change your frock. Plus or minus. Lucy's Sabbath was generally of this amphibious nature. She kept it without hypocrisy in the morning, and broke it without reluctance in the afternoon. As she changed her frock, she wondered whether Cecil was sneering at her. Really, she must overhaul herself and settle everything up before she married him. Mr. Floyd was her partner. She liked music, but how much better tennis seemed. How much better to run about in comfortable clothes than to sit at the piano and feel girt under the arms. Once more music appeared to her the employment of a child. George served, and surprised her by his anxiety to win. She remembered how he had sighed among the tombs at Santa Croce because things wouldn't fit, how after the death of that obscure Italian he had leant over the parapet by the Arno and said to her, degree, I shall want to live, I tell you. Plus or minus, he wanted to live now, to win at tennis, to stand for all he was worth in the sun which had begun to decline and was shining in her eyes, and he did win. Ah, how beautiful the Weald looked. The hills stood out above its radiance, as Fiesole stands above the Tuscan plain, and the south downs, if one chose, were the mountains of Carrara. She might be forgetting her Italy, but she was noticing more things in her England. One could play a new game with the view, and try to find in its innumerable folds some town or village that would do for Florence. Ah! How beautiful the Weald looked. But now Cecil claimed her. He chanced to be in a lucid critical mood, and would not sympathize with exaltation. He had been rather a nuisance all through the tennis, for the novel that he was reading was so bad that he was obliged to read it aloud to others. He would stroll round the precincts of the court and call out, degree, I say, listen to this, Lucy. 3 split infinitives. Plus or minus. Degree, dreadful, plus or minus, said Lucy, and missed her stroke. When they had finished their set, he still went on reading. There was some murder scene, and really everyone must listen to it. Freddie and Mr. Floyd were obliged to hunt for a lost ball in the laurels, but the other two acquiesced. Degree, the scene is laid in Florence. Plus or minus. Degree, what fun, Cecil. Read away. Come, Mr. Emerson, sit down after all your energy. Plus or minus, she had degree forgiven, plus or minus George, as she put it, and she made a point of being pleasant to him. He jumped over the net and sat down at her feet, asking, degree, you and are you tired, plus or minus? Degree, of course I am not, plus or minus. Degree, do you mind being beaten, plus or minus? She was going to answer, degree, no, plus or minus, when it struck her that she did mind, so she answered, degree, yes. Plus or minus, she added merrily, Degree I don tc underscore u re underscore such a splendid player, though. The light was behind you, and it was in my eyes. Plus or minus. Degree I never said I was. Plus or minus. Degree Y, you did, plus or minus. Degree you didn't, t attend. Plus or minus. Degree you said, oh, don t go in for accuracy at this house. We all exaggerate, and we get very angry with people who don t. Plus or minus. Degree the scene is laid in Florence, plus or minus, repeated Cecil, with an upward note. Lucy recollected herself. Degree sunset. Leonora was speeding, plus or minus. Lucy interrupted. Degree Leonora? Is Leonora the heroine? Who's the book by, plus or minus? Degree Joseph Emery Prank. Sunset. Leonora, speeding across the square. Pray. The saints she might not arrive too late. Sunset, the sunset of Italy. Under Orcagna's loggia, the Loggia de Lanzi, as we sometimes call it. Now plus or minus. Lucy burst into laughter. Degree Joseph Emery Prank indeed. Wyatt's Miss Lavish. It's Miss Lavish's novel, and she's publishing it under somebody else's name. Plus or minus. Degree who may Miss Lavish be, plus or minus. Degree, oh, a dreadful person. Emma Emerson, you remember Miss Lavish, plus or minus. Excited by her pleasant afternoon, she clapped her hands. George looked up. Degree of course I do. I saw her the day I arrived at Summer Street. It was she who told me that you lived here. Plus or minus. Degree whereunto you pleased, plus or minus. She meant degree to see Miss Lavish, plus or minus, but when he bent down to the grass without replying, it struck her that she could mean something else. She watched his head, which was almost resting against her knee, and she thought that the ears were reddening. Degree no wonder the novel's bad, plus or minus, she added. Degree, I never liked Miss Lavish. But I suppose one ought to read it as one's met her. Plus or minus. Degree, all modern books are bad, plus or minus, said Cecil, who was annoyed at her inattention, and vented his annoyance on literature. Degree, everyone writes for money in these days. Plus or minus. Degree, oh, Cecil, plus or minus. Degree, it is so. I will inflict Joseph Emery Prank on you no longer. Plus or minus. Cecil, this afternoon seemed such a twittering sparrow. The ups and downs in his voice were noticeable, but they did not affect her. She had dwelt amongst melody and movement, and her nerves refused to answer to the clang of his. Leaving him to be annoyed, she gazed at the black head again. She did not want to stroke it, but she saw herself wanting to stroke it. The sensation was curious. Degree, how do you like this view of ours, Mr. Emerson, plus or minus? Degree, I never notice much difference in views. Plus or minus. Degree, what do you mean, plus or minus? Degree, because they all alike. Because all that matters in them is distance and air. Plus or minus. Degree plus or minus, said Cecil, uncertain whether the remark was striking or not. Degree my father, plus or minus. He looked up at her, and he was a little flushed. Degree says that there is only one perfect view, the view of the sky straight over our heads, and that all these views on earth are but bungled copies of it. Plus or minus. Degree, I expect your father has been reading Dante, plus or minus, said Cecil, fingering the novel, which alone permitted him to lead the conversation. Degree, he told us another day that views are really crowds of trees and houses and hills, and are bound to resemble each other, like human crowds, and that the power they have over us is sometimes supernatural. For the same reason. Plus or minus. Lucy's lips parted. Degree, for a crowd is more than the people who make it up. Something gets added to it, no one knows how, just as something has got added to those hills. Plus or minus. He pointed with his racket to the South Downs. Degree, what a splendid idea, plus or minus, she murmured. Degree, I shall enjoy hearing your father talk again. I am so sorry he is not so well. Plus or minus. Degree, no, he isn't well. Plus or minus. Degree, there's an absurd account of a view in this book, plus or minus, said Cecil. Degree, also that men fall into two classes, those who forget views and those who remember them even in small rooms. Plus or minus. Degree, Mr. Emerson, have you any brothers or sisters, plus or minus? Degree, none. Why, plus or minus? Degree, you spoke of us. Plus or minus. Degree, my mother, I was meaning. Plus or minus. Cecil closed the novel with a bang. Degree, oh, Cecil, how you made me jump, plus or minus. Degree, I will inflict Joseph Emery prank on you no longer. Plus or minus. Degree, I can just remember us all three going into the country for the day and seeing as far as Hindhead. It is the first thing that I remember. Plus or minus. Cecil got up. The man was ill-bred. He hadn't put on his coat after tennis. He didn't do. He would have strolled away if Lucy had not stopped him. Degree, Cecil, do read the thing about the view. Plus or minus. Degree, not while Mr. Emerson is here to entertain us. Plus or minus. Degree, no, read away. I think nothing is funnier than to hear silly things read out loud. If Mr. Emerson thinks us frivolous, he can go. Plus or minus. This struck Cecil as subtle, and pleased him. It put their visitor in the position of a prig. Somewhat mollified, he sat down again. Degree, Mr. Emerson, go and find tennis balls. Plus or minus. She opened the book. Cecil must have his reading and anything else that he liked. But her attention wandered to George's mother, who, according to Mr. Eager, had been murdered in the sight of God and, according to her son, had seen as far as Hindhead. Degree, am I really to go, plus or minus? Asked George. Degree, no, of course not really, plus or minus, she answered. Degree, chapter 2, plus or minus, said Cecil, yawning. Degree, find me chapter 2, if it isn't bothering you. Plus or minus. Chapter 2 was found, and she glanced at its opening sentences. She thought she had gone mad. Degree, here, hand me the book. Plus or minus. She heard her voice saying, Degree, it isn't worth reading, it's too silly to read. I never saw such rubbish. It oughtn't to be allowed to be printed. Plus or minus. He took the book from her. Degree, Leonora, plus or minus, he read. Degree sat pensive and alone. Before her lay the rich champaign of Tuscany, dotted over with many a smiling village. The season was spring. Plus or minus. Miss Lavish knew, somehow, and had printed the past in draggled prose for Cecil to read and for George to hear. Degree, a golden haze, plus or minus, he read. He read, Degree, afar off the towers of Florence, while the bank on which she sat was carpeted with violets. All unobserved, Antonio stole up behind her, plus or minus. Lest Cecil should see her face, she turned to George and saw his face. He read, Degree, there came from his lips no wordy protestation such as formal lovers use. No eloquence was his, nor did he suffer from the lack of it. He simply enfolded her in his manly arms. Plus or minus. Degree, this isn't the passage I wanted, plus or minus, he informed them. Degree, there is another much funnier, further on. Plus or minus, he turned over the leaves. Degree, should we go into tea, plus or minus, said Lucy, whose voice remained steady. She led the way up the garden, Cecil following her, George last. She thought a disaster was averted. But when they entered the shrubbery, it came. The book, as if it had not worked mischief enough, had been forgotten, and Cecil must go back for it, and George, who loved passionately, must blunder against her in the narrow path. Degree, no, plus or minus, she gasped, and, for the second time, was kissed by him. As if no more was possible, he slipped back. Cecil rejoined her. They reached the upper lawn alone.